Okay, today's daf we're going to be learning is Yoma Kafbet. We have a really interesting set of dapim coming up about inner workings in the temple and personalities, as we saw in Shkalim, that when you get to the temple and you start to deal with the personalities and what goes on, we're going to have some interesting stories, maybe somewhat disturbing stories, but very understandable why things would have been this way. So we're starting with the second chapter. Now, we were talking about Yom Kippur and all that happens on Yom Kippur and the week before and then the day before. Now we're going to get to what happens on a regular basis in the temple. Okay, they're kind of a little bit diverging to talk about the payasot and the lotteries that went on in the temple. First of all, the word pious is interesting. One of the etymologies of the word pious is a lottery. And the Meiri says that pious is milashon lihit payes, in order to appease people. And a lottery appeases people because you want to get a particular job. And, if you do a lottery, then at least it's not because you didn't want to choose me, but because it was just random. So that's an interesting explanation of the etymology of that word. So the Mishnah starts off, originally, this is a type of style of a Mishnah where it starts to explain the history of how things happen. Originally, it used to be one way. Over time, that changed. So originally, anyone who wanted to do the activity of Trumat HaDeshen, why are we starting with Trumat HaDeshen? Trumat HaDeshen is, again, you take a small amount, very symbolic, a small amount of the ashes from the altar where everything was burning. You do it very, very early in the morning. And it depends also on what day when you do it. If it's holiday, it might be a little bit different, but you do it usually before sunrise. And you take a little bit of those ashes. The Kohen does that. He puts them, samo etzel hamizbeach. If you look at your maps, there's a little square on the eastern side of the ramp of the altar. And that's called the place where they put the deshen. They put it there in this pile. So in the beginning, anyone who wanted to do that could do it. It was first come, first serve. Okay, classic first come, first serve. Ubizman shehem merubin. And if a lot of them wanted to do it, so they would have a race. They would run up the ramp. Whoever gets to now we're going to have to see what 4 cubits these are, but whoever gets 4 cubits, gets there to the 4 cubits before his friend or something like that. We'll have to see exactly what this 4 cubits is. Zacha, he wins the race. Okay. So whoever crosses the finish line first, basically wherever this finish line is, wins and he gets to do it. What if they both get there at exactly the same time? So the person in charge says, okay, let's do a count. Put your fingers out. Right? This is like eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Okay, everybody puts their fingers out. We're going to talk about this a little more tomorrow. What do they put out? 1 or 2 fingers. You can't put a thumb out. Okay, now why? So first of all, we're going to see the 1 or 2 fingers isn't that they count twice. Like I was thinking when I was a kid, you'd either put out 1 finger or 2 fingers, right? Now, if you put out 2 fingers, you have a bigger chance of winning. So it seems a little bit unfair. So they didn't really put out 2 fingers. We'll have to see what this 2-finger thing is. You can't put out your thumb because if you put out your thumb, you could also put out your pinky and make it look like you're 2 different kohanim. Because imagine the circle of just fingers. And they'll just count. They won't realize that we're always worried about people tricking, people taking advantage, etc. So now we're going to say, so that's what they would do. So they would count. Now it seems the way they would do it, we'll talk maybe about this more tomorrow, but they would come up with some random number, usually a high number, the Mefarshim say, so that no one can kind of, the Kohen in charge who's counting, he picks the number. So he could kind of rig it, right? If he picks 10, he knows which one's the 10th. So we'd probably pick a number like 60 or something like that, or 100. And then what would happen is he'd do a count, and whichever finger came out. Also, it seems that if there's 2 people who tie, it seems they bring a whole bunch of people and then do a lot, like a count like that, because otherwise with 2 people, you can easily, even if you pick a number like 60, you know where the even numbers and the odds are, and you know exactly where it's going to come out. So again, you have to worry about all these concerns. Here comes our big story, okay? There was a case where there were 2 neck and neck running up that ramp. One pushed the other and knocked over the other guy because he wanted to win, right? I think of these car races, and how they make sure the person, we see these things, they try to get the guy off track, and he basically pushed him over, falls off the ramp, which was, at a decent height, and he broke his leg. Okay, wait till tomorrow's story where it's much more severe than this. Okay, this is the mild version of the story. Okay, there's two versions of the story. Some people say it's two different situations that happen, but it's much more likely that they're two different versions of the same story. So what happened? Kevan shera'u beit din. Here's the really interesting line, and I see you're writing in the chat, and obviously this is very relevant to what unfortunately just happened in Meron. I want to take one idea out of this to think about. Kevan shera'u beit din sheba'im lidei sakana. So now the court saw, wow, right. Unfortunately, it takes a terrible incident for the court to wake up and realize something here is not right, which really reminds us of what just happened, unfortunately. It's kinu shelo yehu tomim mitamizbeach ela b'pais. So they came in and they said, we have to change things. Right. So this is a very interesting comparison to what's going on, right? You take a situation like that and you say, something's got to change, right? And it'll be interesting to see what changes are instituted in light of what happened. It's unfortunate always that it happens always in hindsight and not before. We'll talk about it. Why didn't the rabbis anticipate that this would happen, right? Just like you could ask about what happened in Meron, right? Why wasn't it anticipated, right? Obviously, everybody has their own theories about this. I'm definitely not getting into that here, but that's the number one, the questions, right? These are the questions asked. Why did no one take the proper precautions? And now that it happened, what are we doing in the future to make sure that this never happens again? So the rabbis immediately come in and say, okay, we're changing the system. We have to have a lottery system. We're no longer going to have this first come, first serve. This obviously doesn't do well for us. So let's change the system. And by the way, there were 4 lotteries in the temple, and this was the first one. Okay, every day they would do 4 lotteries. We're going to get to them throughout our chapter. So now the Gemara starts off and says, the exact question, okay, that everyone's asking, right? Why didn't they start like this, right? Why didn't they realize that maybe this would happen? What were they thinking? Okay, were they thinking? What were they thinking? So in fact, the Gemara is going to say, oh, they had it really clearly thought out. They just, okay, this reminds me, I studied some economics in university, and economics, right, I remember it was kind of almost, certainly when you study it in entry level. So it's all about what can you assume human behavior will be, right? We all know you cannot assume what human behavior is going to be because you just don't know, right? You might assume human behavior will be a certain way, and you might be wrong because every human behaves differently. We all know that. And it's right, to a certain extent, you can track human behavior. To another extent, you don't really know what's going to happen. So they thought about it, and they did think about what was going to be, but they obviously made a mistake. We're going to have 2 reasons why they thought that this wasn't going to be a problem. So the first reason, okay, we're going to have 2 different versions of what they thought. They didn't think it was going to be the most coveted job. Okay, it happens at night. Now, why is that relevant? So the first answer is going to explain that things that happen at night in the temple are much less significant. We know, we've talked about this before. Everything goes on in the temple during the day. You can't do most things at night. So anything that can be done at night is obviously not such an important job. And therefore, they figured no one was going to even want the job. So therefore, they said, first come, first serve to incentivize people to come, right? They figure you're not really so excited about doing the job, but if you know that if I get there first, I'll get the job, then maybe you'll want to do it, right? Because then you'll say, okay, well, at least I know my chances of getting the job are high, so you'll go make the bother. Therefore, but then what happened? They had no idea how many people really want to do this job. They thought nobody was going to want it. So they didn't make a big deal. They just said first come, first serve. But then, right, kind of, they were doing it to incentivize people, but it went much farther than they anticipated. And therefore, takidule payasa, right? So once they saw, sorry, I skipped a line, I think, then once they saw the people came, now here's the big line, right? They saw people came. Now, was there a break between the time that they saw lots of people coming and then they realized this is coming to this is going to be a very dangerous situation, right? That's right. If you think about those hordes of people that came to Meron, right? They knew that was happening, right? And then unfortunately, it was only once it came lidei sakana did they realize we have to do something about this. So right? There's lots of comparisons you can make here. I'm going to leave the rest to you to think about. But anyway, so then they realized there was coming like then to kino la payasa. Okay, so once they realized that there was actually interest and people wanted this, so then they instituted a lottery. What's interesting is we're going to see later, there was even another stage of rethinking, which is just fascinating, I think, to see how the rabbis were constantly reassessing, right? Sometimes you think, oh, the rabbis are stuck in the way things go and they don't change things. But here, no, there was a need, they changed it. And then we're going to see there was more need and they changed it again. So it's interesting to think about how they're constantly rethinking how can we do things in a better way that will be more effective and less dangerous. So now they're going to ask some questions about this. The assumption of this answer is, anything that's done at night is going to be less of interest to the Kohanim, and therefore, if it's less of interest, it doesn't need a lottery, unless, of course, it comes to this dangerous situation. But the fats and the limbs of the korban tamid that get burnt on the altar, or for all intents and purposes, right, all the parts that get burnt on the altar can be burnt at night. So that's avodat lailahi. And yet, takinu le rabbanan payasa. Okay, the takinu rabbanan, the rabbis instituted a pious for it. So even though it's done at night, they instituted a pious for it. So why? They did that before there was any kind of dangerous, scary situation, the bad thing that happened. So if you're saying the whole idea is at night, no one's interested in doing these activities, that was an activity that happened at night. And yet there was also a lottery for it. So they say, oh no, if Arim Darim is different, and by the way, we're going to see this in a number of dapim, Sof Avodah Diyamamihi. It's actually the end of the day. Okay, it's Sof Avodah Diyamama. That closes the sacrifices of the day. Now, it's a night activity, but it's an activity that's really connected with all the activities of the day. Even it can be done during the day also. So therefore, that's different. Hainami. But this also, you could say that the Trumat HaDeshen, the removal of the ashes, is also the beginning of the day activities. Even though it's done at night, it's really the beginning of the day activities. Now, why is this? Rabbi Yochanan says, if you washed your hands, the Kohanim had to wash their hands in the morning when they woke up. If you washed your hands for the Trumat HaDeshen, which was done at night, you don't need to wash your hands in the morning because you already washed them at night. In other words, you already washed them for the Trumat HaDeshen. Now you might say that was at night and this is the day. So he explains, and this is the important line, Shekfar Kidesh Mitchila La'avodah. He already sanctified his hands to start the work of the day. So it sounds like the Trumat HaDeshen is the start of the work of the day. To which the Gemara answers, now you can change what Rabbi Yochanan says. Now this is interesting. They're going to change it because you're going to see later on a few dapim. They're going to come back to these two lines and they're going to question some other thing with the Evarim Uktarim that's at night and the Tormim HaDeshen that's at night. And they're going to basically say the Evarim Uktarim is connected with the previous day, and the Trumat HaDeshen is connected with the upcoming day. And they're going to use this without rejecting it, without the new reading. Here, that's not what we want to get to. We want to say there's a difference between them. So they're going to answer it a little bit differently. You should read it as he already washed his hands for some sort of work. Not that the work is connected to the day, but he did wash his hands already. So therefore he doesn't need to do it again. But he washed it for some activity at night. It just happens to be that he already washed them and therefore doesn't need to wash them again. But this doesn't necessarily prove that he basically changed the words because it seems very similar. Instead of saying Kidesh mitchilat avodah, from the beginning of the work of the day, no, it's mitchilat le avodah, for service. Okay, in which case it's for a different service, but service of the night, service of the day. Therefore, it's not the same as the Evarim Uktarim. And that's why, again, they thought that no one was going to want it. They didn't need a pious for that, even though they did have a pious already from before. They had a lottery for the Evarim Uktarim. That's different than this. Ikeda Amre, second reason as to why the rabbis thought that no one was going to want this job. And this is something you probably would have thought of on your own. They're doing this in the middle of the night, basically, or very early in the morning. Now that's right. Sleep is going to overtake you. You'd much rather sleep in the morning than go do this work, wake up before the crack of dawn or at the crack of dawn to do this job. It's not exactly something you're dying to do. So they say, so they say, but they saw that people would do it. Right? I like to sometimes get up early Shabbos morning and take a walk. But sometimes, it's the bed is calling me as much as I want to do it. It's hard for me to pull myself out of bed. So it's the same idea here, right? You might want to do it, but you have that bed pulling you. It's sometimes you feel that magnetic pull in your bed that you just can't pull yourself out of bed. So it's like that, right? So the same thing there with the Kohanim, they wouldn't want to pull themselves out of bed. And therefore, right? But then in the end, what they see, they were wrong about it. People actually really wanted to have an opportunity to do it. So they all got up. And again, then it became very competitive and competition, right? Again, this leads to another question about, is competition a good thing? Is it not a good thing, right? All that. So now, hare evarim uptarim. Okay, right? I see someone's comparing this to waking up in the morning for daf, right? So I don't have a choice in the matter. So for me, that's less of an issue. Maybe for other people, the pull to get out of bed is, sometimes the bed pulls you in, sometimes not. I don't get that choice. Okay. What about Evarim Uptarim? They also are done at night, which means you might drift off to sleep at night. You might rather, right? Sometimes it's really hard to go out at night to go to something, right? Also, you feel, I'm exhausted. I just don't want to go out of the house. So you might say the same thing. Also there, people are exhausted by the end of the day. Maybe they won't want to do the Evarim Uptarim, and yet there's a lottery for it. So there is a lottery. So that's not a good excuse. So they say no. Okay, you can debate this, right? It's harder to get out of bed than it is, right? That pull at night that makes you want to fall asleep. That's not the same as the pull of when you're in bed and you actually have to wake up early. That's much harder. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute. That's the reason why they made this takana, because of the sakana. There was a different reason why they made this. Okay, or actually the takana, the actual question is like this, actually. It's not, the change that the rabbis made was this, that they instituted this pious, but wasn't the change that they made something else? The change they made in the pious wasn't, should there be a pious, shouldn't there be a pious? The change was that instead of being a pious just for the Trumat Hadeshen, they added other jobs. That when you do the lottery, if you win this lottery, you will get, number one, the Trumat Hadeshen, the removing of the ashes. You'll also get to put on, they would do a crisscross, like a Shtiva Erev, the warp and the woof. They would do laying of the logs on the Maracha. That's the Sidor Atzei Maracha. And then the Shnei Gzirei Eitzim. In addition, we're going to get into all these in a few dapim also. A Kohen, there was a job of one of the Kohanim. Actually, I think in the morning it was one Kohen, in the afternoon two, or the reverse. But they would bring two logs and put the logs on top of the big pile. Okay, and that was kind of like the final act to then you'd be able to burn, make the do the fire, burn on the altar the sacrifice. So whoever got to do that also got to do that job. So wasn't that the takana that they instituted? So Amar Ravashi Shtei Takanot Havu. As I told you, they rethought things a few times. So now we're going to see what happened. So we're going to start off with our first takana. They thought people were not going to come. So this we've seen a few times, right? Since they saw people came anyway, so they instituted the pies. Because then, right, it came to this dangerous situation where one guy broke a leg, and we'll see tomorrow a much worse situation. Now what happened? Okay, here let's take, right? Sometimes you make changes and they're not always such good changes. So what happened? Well, now that there's a pious, and now that, remember we talked about before, you'll pull yourself out of bed because you know if I run there, I might get to do it. But if you know that it's beyond your control and it's just a random lottery and your chances of winning are slim, you're not going to get out of bed. And number one, you have to pull yourself out of bed. Number two, it's not really such an interesting job. So to do that little job super early in the morning, there's not so much incentive. So therefore, lo atu, people stopped coming. They'd rather sleep. They weren't so interested in doing this job. So now they had a bigger problem that they didn't have anyone. These people said, what are the chances are that I'm going to get chosen? So I'm not going to bother. Hadar, it's kinule. Then they made another takana. So there were two different takanot here. They wanted to make it more appealing to people that they would get to do more jobs and not just this one job. And that would pull people out of bed and get them to be part of this lottery and get them to do the job. Because otherwise, right, you went from too many people and the fighting over it to no people, and now you're stuck, right? So this is, classic. You have to really think about what are going to be the ramifications of any changes that you make and how is it going to affect all sorts of other things, which again goes back to our story of what just happened. Also a question, how are you going to change things? What, how's that going to affect all sorts of other issues? Ubizman shehen merubim. Now we get back to the Mishnah and they're quoting the line, when there were a lot of people, they would run up the ramp and whoever got there first would win, right? Within 4 amot. So what 4 cubits are we talking about? Amar Papa. Pshitali arba amot alalo. We're clearly not talking about the 4 cubits before the ramp, right? Whoever gets the 4 cubits before the ramp will win. Why? Because it says, let's see, it says clearly in the Mishnah, they would run up the ramp. So clearly it's on the ramp somewhere. What 4 cubits on the ramp? Kamai tanamilo. It's clearly not the first 4 cubits of the ramp because it says ratzim va'olim bakevich tanan. If you're running up the ramp, it's certainly not that the finish line is the first 4 cubits that when you got there. That wouldn't make any sense. The hadar, and it also said kol hakodem et chavero. Someone would have to get there before his friend. That doesn't make any sense. Debeni beni namilo. It's also not somewhere randomly in the middle because de lo masayim milta. There's no marker in the middle where there's like a finish line where it'd be clear you got to this point before I did, right? What point exactly would that be? It would be very complicated. And therefore it must be the 4 cubits just before the altar, okay? So when you're going up the ramp, right, the 4 cubits within the top of the ramp, which is probably what you thought to begin with. By Rav Papa, but now he asked the following question. Arba amot amru, this is his real question. V'hadama yisod v'amar sovev, o dilma bar me'amar yisod v'amar sovev. We talked about the fact that the ramp takes up, it's 32 cubits long and the Mizbeach is 32 cubits at its base. But if you remember, when we counted it in the room, we only got to 62 cubits that it takes up and not 64. Because as the ramp goes up, if you remember, the base of the altar is 28 by 28 and not 30 by 30, right? And then you have the base, you have the Sovev, which is at the mid-height or a little bit above the mid-height of the altar, that juts out in Amma, and you have the base at the bottom, which juts out in Amma. That's what makes it 32 by 32. So when you have the ramp, it overlaps because it gets to the top of the altar, which is only 28. So you have those 2 cubits at the bottom, right? It's 28 to 32 because you have 2 on each, right? There's 2 extra cubits on each side. So altogether you'll end up with 28, but it's 2 cubits on this side and 2 cubits on that side. So the 2 cubits on the side where the ramp is are basically underneath. Right? This is just a review of what we talked about the other day. They're underneath that ramp. So the question is, when we said 4 cubits to the top of the altar, do we mean to the top, which is 4 cubits from the end of the ramp? Or is it 4 cubits to where the Mizbeach starts under the ramp, which would be another 2 cubits, right? It would be 6 cubits from actually the top of the base of the ramp. Okay, what's the relevance of this question? Nobody really knows because not only do we not do this anymore, but even in the time of the temple, they didn't do it anymore. They only did it originally when they had this race before they stopped the whole thing of the races. So it's a good question. Why is he even asking this? And the Gemara answers in its typical Teiku fashion. We don't know the answer to this question. It's a good question. Or maybe not a good question, but anyway, it's a question. Now we're going to talk a little bit about this lottery that they did, or right, if they both got there at the exact same time, what would they do? So the person in charge would say, put out your fingers. Tana, hotziu etzbotehen leminyan v'nimninu liditu, right? Put your fingers out and we will count your fingers. So Masaya el Rabbi Yitzchak, and now we're going to get off on a tangent. This clearly supports Rabbi Yitzchak. Dama Rabbi Yitzchak, asur limnot et Yisrael afilu lidvar mitzvah. If they're just counting bodies, why wouldn't you count bodies? Why would you count fingers? Especially when we talked about already, someone could put out a thumb and a pinky and try to trick, right? Just count heads, right? Okay, we're going to get to 100 and whichever head I get to, I get to. So from here, you see that what Rabbi Yitzchak says must be right. This is a further proof for what he says, that asur limnot Yisrael afilu lidvar mitzvah. Even for the purposes of a mitzvah, you can't count the Jewish people. This is very famous. You don't count people. We're going to see what the source is. Dichtiv. Okay, we're going to first source. Both sources are about Shaul HaMelech, King Saul. Vayifkedem bebezek. He counts his people in Bezek. Now, what's bebezek? So you might think Bezek, right? It's a telephone company, right? That's not what it is here. Bezek, they're going to assume means they counted people with shards. Okay, they took shards of earthenware vessels. They gave each person a shard, and then everybody put in their shards, and they counted the shards. Kind of like the machatzira shekel, right? I mean, there they needed the money, but it was also a way of counting the people. Matkipa Ravashi. Rav Ashi says, how do you know that bezek is shards? Dilma shma matahu. Maybe it's the name of a city. Now, they don't just make this up. They're going to prove that they see elsewhere that it's the name of a city. Kedichtiv, and they leave out the most important word in the pasuk here, and I'll tell you what it is. But this is in the beginning of Sefer Shoftim. If you remember, there's a person called Adoni Bezek. Vayimtzu Adoni Bezek. The important part is the next word, Bi Bezek. They found him in Bezek. Okay, that's where he lived. So Elamehach. So therefore, Bezek is clearly a city. So why wouldn't you say Vayifkadim? He counted them in Bezek, in the city Bezek, and then it doesn't have anything to do with how he counted them, and then we don't learn anything for our situation. Oh, we have a different situation when he went to fight against Amalek. And I'm specifically telling you this is in the war of Amalek because from here we're going to get off on a tangent about Shaul and Amalek and how he sinned and he didn't want to kill the king and some different things about Shaul, and we're going to compare him to David Amelech and the difference between Shaul's sins and David's sins and why did Shaul lose the Malchut and David got to keep the kingship. And even though David also sinned and even sinned more than Shaul, and we're going to talk about that. So we're going to get off on a total tangent, and tomorrow we'll get back to our topic. So he says, anyone who counts the people transgresses a negative commandment. Now, it's a little bit strange because a negative commandment usually is something from the Torah. And here we're going to quote a verse from Hosea, okay, which is a Nevi'im Achronim. Okay, it's a little bit strange. Shenema, v'haya mispar b'nei Israel kechol hayam asher lo yimad, and the continuation is lo yisafer. Okay, the people are going, the Jews are going to be so large like the sand in the sea that is not measurable. Yimad is measurable, v'lo yisafer, and can't be counted. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak amar over b'shnei lavin shenemar lo yimad v'lo yisafer. He says it's even two negative commandments you've transgressed because it says both can't be measured and can't be counted. So you've done two. Right? Whether this is a real lo taseh is hard to explain because, like I said, it doesn't say it in the Torah. Usually we connect negative commandments to the Torah, not to the Nevi'im, but maybe they're just trying to say this is a bad thing to do. Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, Rabbi Yonatan Rami. So now we're going to bring a contradiction here. It says, K'tiv, v'hayam mispar b'nei Israel kechol hayam, u'k'tiv asher lo yimad v'lo yisafer. There's a bit of a contradiction in this passage. It says they're like sand. Now, it's true sand is hard to count, but theoretically, it's something that could potentially be counted. I mean, go try yourself, I don't know. But theoretically, it's something finite. It's not something infinite. Then it says, as if it's infinite. So, lo kashya, we're going to have two answers. This is when the Jews keep what God commanded, then there will be so many that it'll be infinite. If they don't do the will of God, then there'll be less people and they'll be able to be counted. Rebbe has a totally different approach. Rebbe Amal Mishum Rabbi Abba ben Dostai lo kashya. Kambi de Adam, kambi de Shamayim. It's actually all one and the same. They'll always be like that. It's just a matter of God can count them. So from his perspective, we're like sand. He can count sand. We can't count sand. So bide Adam, they won't be able to be counted. So therefore, there's this distinction between the big distinction between the two answers is, according to one, it might vary depending on the situation. According to this, it's not varying depending on the situation. It's just a matter of whose perspective. God can count us because he's God. But man or woman, right? You can't be counted by humans. Now we're going to learn something about Shaul that we learn from this situation. First, he counted the people using shards. Then he counted the people using sheep. What does that show? An interesting thing. What was the difference between the two times? One was in the beginning when he first became appointed, and one was after. So, once you become in a public position, mit asher, you usually become wealthy. Okay, I don't know exactly what the meaning of this is, but that's what it says here. Because the fact that first he used shards, he didn't have expensive things to divide up. Once he was very wealthy, he didn't mind giving everybody a sheep and counted them using sheep. He had that many sheep that he could afford to give everybody a sheep. And, that, again, I don't think he was giving it to them to keep, but he had enough sheep to pass around. He must have become very wealthy. Maybe each person brought their own sheep. Maybe it wasn't that he had so many sheep and he was so wealthy, but maybe you can't learn that from here. Well, then what was the point of telling us? In other words, Why would the Gemara go to tell us that he counted them with sheep or he counted them with shards? There must be a reason, right? Why would the Sefer Shmuel tell us this? Right? Why would they list it in the book? There's no point. The point is, it's to teach you this idea that he got wealthy and that people who become, right? Maybe this reference to the Kohen Gadol we talked about, right? This whole thing is about leadership, and we're going to talk about corrupt leadership and good leadership. And also, I think that there's an indication here, all this discussion about the Kohen Gadol and who he is, and he needs to be wealthy and all that, and also how he needs to behave, and how these Kohanim, who are supposed to be leaders of the community, were knocking each other off ramps, and in their desire to serve God, there's something wrong in the system. And therefore, we're going to, I think they're getting into leadership and where the problems come from. Vayarev banachal. So now it says, okay, this is a strange line. You might not think it's so strange, but they say, okay, the pasuk we quoted before, where he counted them b'tzlaim, the next verse, okay, we're in Sefer Shmuel Aleph, Perek Tevav, chapter 15, verse 5. Vayavo Shaul ad Ir Amalek vayarev banachal. He goes to Ir Amalek, the city of Amalek, and he fights in the Nachal, the wadi. So now, what's strange about this? There was no wadi there. Okay, the Amalekim didn't live by a Nachal, so it must be something else. So Amar Rabbi Meni al iskei Nachal. He came about issues that had to do with the Nachal. What has to do with the Nachal? Egla arufa, if you remember, is when there's a dead body found in between two cities, and you measure to the closest city. And then you take a heifer and you an egel and you break its neck next to a nachal. So there's the connection of egla rufa and nachal, and it's a reference to a fight about inyanei nachal. And you might have thought Vayarev, according to the Pshat, is obviously he goes to fight against the Amalekim. But here we're going to see he fights with God about egla arufa. And now we're going to see what that means. When God told him, Lech v'kitat Amalek, remember he's told he's supposed to wipe everybody out. All the men, women, children, animals, everything. Amal, he said, Uman, right? Remember his big sin. He has Rachmanut on the king, and he doesn't kill the king. So Amal, Uman nefesh echat amra Torah have egla rufa. If one person dies and we have to bring an egla rufa for it, that's the iskei nachal. Kol nefashot halalu alacha kama v'kama. Why should I kill all these innocent people? V'im adam chata, and if a person sinned, behemama chata. What did the animal do wrong? Right, this is interesting. It's almost a reference to our sacrifices and all that. And if the older people sin, right, the children can't be held responsible. Of heavenly voice came down and said to him, Al tihit sadiq harbe. Don't be so righteous. Don't always look for, right? Sometimes, right, you can't be too extreme. We're going to see his other extreme in another minute. Okay. Don't be too righteous about things. Okay, now you have to know some other. This is the whole Nevi'im, right? It's a Navi Shiur today. David was running away from Shaul at some point, and he goes to Nov Ir HaKohanim. Okay, it was a city of Kohanim, and he tells them he's there for the king, and he asks them for food and water, and they give him. And then Doeg HaEdomi, who's one of Shaul's people, goes and rats on them and says, look, they helped David. And Shaul comes in and he kills everybody. Okay, and the verse even says there, okay, and this is the very important verse that the Gemara doesn't tell you this, but if you see the verse, it makes it very clear. It says there, just find it, 1 second. It says, here, that Nov Ir HaKohanim, so Shaul comes to Nov Ir HaKohanim, he kalafi cherev, he killed by the sword, Me'ish va'adisha, okay, men, women, me'olel va'ad yonek, little teeny children, v'shor v'chamor v'selefi cherev. He killed all the animals, everything, right there. When it came to Agag, he was all, whoa, we should be worried about killing everybody. And when it came to avenging the people who helped David, he basically killed everybody. So here it says, so what happened? And he didn't do it, but he told Doeg to do it. Okay, in other words, right? First of all, it lessens his whole feeling of tzedek, and he was so, these people didn't do anything wrong. Same thing with Novi Ir HaKohanim. They in fact didn't even know that they were helping David to protect him from running away from Shaul. And right, it shows that he wasn't really true in his feelings before. He must have had other motives. And here it shows that, right, there's this balance. Don't be too righteous. Don't be too evil, right? Try to find some middle ground. Amar Rav Huna, Kama lo chale v'lo margish gavra demare sieh. When someone's sick, they don't always realize, but it's really God who helps him. How are we going to see this? Shaul ba'achat v'al talu. David b'shtayim v'lo al talu. Shaul sinned one, and yet he got punished. And it's God behind everything. God punished him and took away the kingship from him. David b'shtayim, he did two sins, and yet lo al talu. Okay, in other words, God has his ways. He's the one who orchestrates things. Shaul ba'achat ma'hi. So what was the one thing that Shaul did because of that? He lost the kingdom. Ma'aseh da'agag, because he had mercy on Agag and didn't listen to God when God told him kill everybody. What do you mean only one? He did two, right? He also killed out the city of Nov. Why didn't you say he did two like David? As they were trying to show Shaul did less and yet he got punished more. So he really did the same. He also did two. We'll get soon in a minute to the two of David. And is it really two? Maybe it's more. But now they're going to say, no. When it came, why is that not counted? Already, when Agag happened before Nov Irakonim, God already punished him and said, listen, I'm sorry that I made you king. And basically, it was clear at that point, God had decided you were not going to have the kingship anymore. So already from there, he lost the kingship. David b'shtayim, what are the two of David? De Uriah uda hasata. Number one, Uriah, that he basically sent him out to be killed. And because he wanted to marry his wife, Bathsheba, and de hasata, that he counted the people also. If you remember, later on in David's life, he counts the people and there's a big plague. So first of all, they say, wait, Hayikama said to Bathsheba. In other words, yes, it's true, he killed Uriah Chiti, but what about sleeping with Bathsheba when she was married to Uriah? Hatami pavumine. Oh, there, when we're talking only about the two he did that he did get punished for. For Bathsheba, he got punished. And then some, right? What did he get punished? If you remember, the Navi comes and says, I'm going to give you a mashal. He gives him the story of a man who had only one kivsa, and you take that, and then this person comes and takes that poor person's one sheep, and David says, oh, that's terrible what he did, and he has to pay times 4. So David ends up getting, it was a mashal for David that he took the wife of Uriah, and he has to get paid back 4 times. What 4 times? Yeled, right? The child he had with Bathsheba that night. Amnon, Tamar, and Avshalom. If you remember, Amnon rapes Tamar, and then Avshalom kills Amnon for the fact that he raped Tamar, right? These are all different children of David. Tamar for getting, right, she got raped, and Avshalom for his rebellion, right? And then he gets killed also. So all these people, right, all his sons died. That was his punishment for Bathsheba. So they say, Hatam nami iparu mine. Wait, but also when it came to the counting of the people, he also got punished for. You were trying to find 2 sins he didn't get punished for. There was a big plague among the people. So they say, no, there it wasn't his body. It was the people, but it wasn't he himself that was, physically punished. So they say, when his children died, it also wasn't directly on his body. Now it's true. Children dying is, much more severe. I mean, you might think, maybe it's not. I mean, the nation was his nation. It was almost like his children dying. But both of them, what's the similarity? Neither is on his physical body. Okay, so because of that, they say, that's why it's not considered that he got punished for it. So then they say, what are you talking about? Lai, paru migufe. No, when it comes to Bathsheba, he was, and then when we get to that comparison, then we're stuck because also Bathsheba, he wasn't, and therefore it should have said 3 things he didn't get punished for in his body. But then they say, no. He also got punished in his body for Bathsheba. He had leprosy for 6 months. And the people in the Sanhedrin left him. They wouldn't talk to him. And the Shechina left him. How do we know this? Because in Sefer Tehillim it says, bring back those who fear you and the ones who know your laws. That's the Sanhedrin, who aren't talking to me anymore. That's the Shechina. Bring your Shechina back, because it must have left the Mishkan. Wait, there's more sins. Okay, so we dealt with Bathsheba. Bathsheba's not in this list because he actually got punished. Even if you don't say his sons weren't enough, he did get punished in his body. He had leprosy, and all these other things happened. But really the leprosy is in his body. But wait, Rav says he also accepted Lashon Hara. Story here is there's Mephibosheth, who's the son of Shaul, who was the one left from the house of Shaul. David brings him into his house and he gives him a lot of things. And then, right, he's ochel al shulchan hamelech, he eats at the table of the king. And then Siva comes and tells him at some point, Mephibosheth is trying to be king and he's trying to rebel against you. And the question is, there's a big debate here. Did David accept Lashon Hara? In the end, what happens is, thank you, it's the son of Yonatan. But the house of Shaul is what I meant. What happens is David in the end says, you and Siva, he says to Mephibosheth, are going to split. Okay, he basically takes away what he was going to give to Mephibosheth. And the question is, was he doing it because Siva told him? Or was he doing it because he figured out himself? Okay, so there's a question, did he accept Lashon Hara or did he not? What's interesting about this is you see how important it is to, if you hear Lashon Hara, right, maybe someone tells you something, but you cannot accept it and not act upon it. So the question is, did David act upon it or did he not? So Rav says he did, he acted upon it. And the reason he took away then the Yerusha that he was going to give to Mephibosheth and split it between him and Siva was because he realized, right, he accepted what Siva said about it. So there's another one. Why didn't you list that one? And he didn't get punished for that. So Kishmuel Damar lo kibel David lashon hara. You could say, oh, we have like Shmuel that David didn't actually accept lashon hara. Ulerav nami damar kibel David lashon hara hayipahu minei. Even if you say like Rav, it was another one that he got punished for. Damar Rav Yehuda amar Rav b'sha'ash amar lo David leMephibosheth amarti atav atziva techalku et hasadeh. When he said, listen, the two of you are going to split this inheritance. Yatsa bat kol v'amra lo Rechavam v'Yeravam yechalku et hamachut. In the end, it's so funny because we started off, David didn't get punished and he didn't lose the kingship. In the end, they say, no, he did. It was determined at that point that the kingship was going to split. He didn't lose it entirely, but he did lose a big part of it because the kingdom was going to split. And because he split the Yerusha, because he basically accepted this Lashon Hara, his punishment was that the kingdom was going to ultimately be split between Rechavam and Yeravam, right? The son of Shlomo and with Yeravam. Okay. Ben Shana Shaul b'malcho. Okay, so there's this pasuk that says, right, he was a year. Just 1 second. This let me read the whole pasuk. Ben Shana Shaul b'malcho shtei shanim malach al Yisrael. Okay, he was Ben Shana when he became king. What does this mean? He was a year old, right? Doesn't make any sense. So Amar Rav Huna ki Ben Shana shelo ta'am tamchet. He was so pure. He was a pure soul. He had never sinned at all like a baby. Matkav Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak ve'ema ki Ben Shana shemeluchlach betitu b'tzoah. Why don't you say he was like a 1-year-old who's full of feces and always dirty? That could be an image that he was really full of sin. Well, what happened to Rav Nachman for saying this? He had a nightmare. Okay, it seems he saw evil spirits in his dreams. Some people explain a little differently, but some sort of right. Siyut is the Hebrew word for nightmare. So he saw something terrible in his dream. Amar, he realizes he shouldn't have spoken disrespectfully about Shaul HaMelech, right? Even though he did lose the kingship, still we have to treat him with respect. He was the leader. It's a good question about how you treat leaders that, go in the wrong direction. We're all very not so careful in our speech about how we speak about leaders, at least most of us. Anyway, Amar na'aneti lechem atzmot Shaul ben Kish. She says, I'm sorry to the bones of Shaul ben Kish. Please forgive me. However, that didn't work. Hadar chazis yuta b'chalmi. He still was having these nightmares. What happened? He asked for forgiveness from the Atzmot, the bones of Shaul, but he just called him Shaul ben Kish. He didn't say the king of Israel. Once he said the king of Israel, then he had the proper respect, and then the nightmares went away. What was wrong with Malchut Beit Shaul? Here's another interesting thing about leadership. He had nothing wrong with him. All his lineage was perfect. Everything was perfect, right? As opposed to David, we all know there were problems with his lineage, starting with Yehuda and Tamar, and then there's Ruth and all the Moaviyah and all of that. So the Amar of Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yotzak. Why is that important, right? You think about it. When we try to, right, someone wants to be president, we do background checks, we check out everything, we check into their history as much as we can, get, and then we say, oh, if you have problems, we don't want you to be. I mean, of course, some people anyway end up, but we know we do these very big background checks. So here they're saying background checks, if it pans out bad, that's good. Okay, why is that? Because, and they say, you can only appoint someone who's got like a thing of creepy crawlers, hanging on his back, like hanging over his head. That we want that. Why do we want that? Right? Like, ghosts to bring out. Why? If he gets too arrogant, they say, turn around and go look. In other words, you're nobody, right? Don't think you're no greater than any of the rest of us. You need to have humility. That's a really important trait. Very hard to have humility when you're so perfect and everything is perfect. And that was Shaul's big problem. What was another reason why he got punished? Because he didn't understand that as a king, you can't be mochel on your kavod. You have to be the king and you have to say, the buck stops here. I make the decisions, nobody else. Because otherwise people will walk all over you. What happened? At his inauguration, it says, so, whoa, he's going to, right? Who's this guy? He's going to rescue us. And they didn't bring him anything. And he was silent. What's the next thing that immediately happens? The neighboring, right? The Nachash Amoni comes in and says, hey, I see this guy, I could walk all over him. I'm going to come in and attack because he's not going to do anything. Here he was silent when people disrespected him. This guy's going to be silent. So we have a lot of ideas from today's daf about, human behavior in a crowd, in a big city, right? Or this idea of, wanting to be in the temple part of the service, or maybe not wanting to be lazy, right? We have the whole gamut. We have issues about leadership. What makes a good leader? Why did Shaul lose the kingship? Why did David not? We have a whole bunch of different approaches. What about their sins, right? Notice they all sinned, right? And what do we do with them? Which ones were they punished for? Which ones were they not? All sorts of interesting ideas to take. And like I said, some relevant to think about for things going on nowadays, whether it comes to leadership or what happened in Meron. Anyway, leave you with a lot of thoughts for the day. We will continue a little more in this tomorrow.